What happens when the man everyone underestimates becomes their only hope for survival? This is the story of a Union soldier whose name would echo through history, not for the mockery he endured, but for the courage that saved an entire regiment when all seemed lost. If stories of incredible courage and redemption inspire you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The morning mist hung heavy over Camp Butler, Illinois, in the spring of 1863. The Union Army's 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was preparing for what many believed would be their final deployment before the war's end. Among the sea of blue uniforms and weathered faces, one figure stood apart, not by choice but by the cruel hand of fate that had made him different. Samuel Big Sam Washington stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, his broad shoulders casting shadows that seemed to swallow the men around him. His dark skin glistened with sweat as he methodically cleaned his Springfield rifle, each movement precise and deliberate. At 28 years old, Sam had the hands of a blacksmith, which he had been before the war, and the quiet demeanor of a man who had learned that words often brought more trouble than silence. The scars on his hands told stories that his fellow soldiers would never guess. Each callus had been earned not just from working iron and steel, but from countless nights spent guiding desperate families through treacherous terrain, his massive hands gentle enough to comfort a frightened child, strong enough to carry an injured man for miles through hostile territory. The burn mark on his left forearm, which he told curious soldiers came from a forge accident, was actually from a Confederate tracker's brand, a reminder of the night he had been captured while leading a group of escaped slaves, and the brutal interrogation he had endured before managing to escape. "Look at that giant over there," whispered Private Tommy McKenna, a wiry Irish immigrant with freckles scattered across his pale face like autumn leaves. "Bet he can't even fit through a doorway without ducking." McKenna had arrived at the camp 3 weeks earlier, fresh from the docks of Boston, where he had worked loading ships. His prejudices were as deeply ingrained as the dirt under his fingernails, learned from years of competing with freed slaves for the same backbreaking jobs that barely paid enough to survive. To him, Sam represented everything he feared about the changing world, a black man who carried himself with dignity and competence that challenged McKenna's assumptions about racial hierarchy. Corporal Jake Morrison, a farmer's son from Ohio with sandy hair and perpetually dirty fingernails, snickered as he adjusted his pack. "I heard he's so clumsy. He knocked over 3 tents just trying to get to the mess hall yesterday. How's a man that big supposed to move quietly in battle?" Morrison's mockery came from a different place, not hatred, but the casual cruelty of ignorance. He had grown up on a farm where the only black people he had ever seen were field hands working neighboring plantations. In his limited worldview, size meant clumsiness, and dark skin meant inferiority. He genuinely believed he was being clever rather than cruel, never considering the impact of his words on the man who heard every whispered joke, every snickered comment. The mockery wasn't new to Sam. Since joining the regiment 6 months ago, he had endured countless jokes about his size, his race, and his quiet nature. Some called him the gentle giant, with sarcasm dripping from their voices. Others whispered that he was too soft for real combat, that his previous experience had been limited to minor skirmishes where his size alone had intimidated Confederate scouts. What they didn't know, what Sam had never told anyone, was that before the war he had been more than just a blacksmith. He had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, leading escaped slaves through treacherous terrain while Confederate bounty hunters pursued them with bloodhounds and rifles. He had learned to move like a shadow despite his size, to fight with deadly precision when cornered, and to protect others even when it meant risking his own life. The memories came to him unbidden as he worked on his rifle. Sarah, the young woman whose family he had guided to freedom just months before enlisting, she had been barely 18, carrying her infant son while her husband limped along on a leg broken by an overseer's whip. Sam had carried that man for 12 miles through swampland, moving so quietly that the pursuing dogs lost their scent. When Confederate trackers had finally cornered them at a river crossing, Sam had held them off single-handedly while the family escaped, using nothing but a blacksmith's hammer and the kind of fury that comes from seeing too much injustice. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Shaw, the regiment's commanding officer, watched the interactions from his tent with growing concern. Shaw was a young man of 25, born into Boston aristocracy, but driven by an unshakable belief in equality and justice. His blonde hair was always perfectly combed, and his blue eyes held the intensity of someone who had seen too much death for his age. Shaw had volunteered to command the 54th Massachusetts against his family's wishes and social expectations. His father, a wealthy merchant, had wanted him to accept a safe position on a general's staff. His mother had wept when he chose instead to lead black soldiers into combat, fearing not just for his life, but for his social standing. But Shaw had seen slavery firsthand during a trip to Charleston before the war, had witnessed the auction blocks and the whipping posts, and had made a promise to himself that he would spend his life fighting such abominations. Sergeant Williams, Shaw called to his most trusted non-commissioned officer, a battle-hardened veteran with graying temples and scars that told stories of Antietam and Gettysburg. Williams had been Shaw's first choice for the position, despite, or perhaps because of, his unconventional background. The sergeant had served in the regular army for 15 years before volunteering for the 54th Massachusetts. He had fought alongside white soldiers, black soldiers, and Native American scouts, and had learned to judge men by their actions rather than their appearance. His weathered face showed the respect he held for his young commander, but also the wisdom that came from years of seeing how prejudice could destroy unit cohesion and get good men killed. "Yes, sir?" Williams approached, his weathered face showing the respect he held for his young commander. "What's your assessment of Private Washington?" Williams glanced toward Sam, who was now helping a younger soldier, barely 18, adjust his equipment properly. The boy, Private David Chen, was the son of Chinese immigrants who had come to California during the gold rush. He spoke broken English and had been the target of almost as much prejudice as Sam, though his smaller stature made him less visible. Sam had taken the boy under his wing without fanfare, teaching him military procedures with the same patience he had once shown to frightened families on the Underground Railroad. "Honestly, sir, the men don't know what they're talking about. I've been watching him, and there's something different about that one. The way he moves, the way he observes everything. He's not just big, sir, he's calculating, strategic." Williams had noticed things that the other soldiers missed. The way Sam always positioned himself, where he could see all the exits from any room or clearing. How his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, not with the nervous energy of a frightened man, but with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to spot danger. Most telling of all was how Sam moved during night watches. Williams had followed him once, curious about reports that the big man seemed to disappear during his shifts. What he had discovered was that Sam conducted his own reconnaissance patrols, moving through the surrounding countryside with a stealth that should have been impossible for someone his size. Shaw nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed the same thing. There's a reason he volunteered for every dangerous patrol, every reconnaissance mission, and there's a reason he always comes back with valuable intelligence while other scouts come back empty-handed." "The men see his size and assume he's slow," Williams continued. "They see his quiet nature and think he's weak. But I've seen him during training, sir. When he thinks no one is watching, he moves like water, and his marksmanship scores." Williams whistled low. "Best in the regiment, sir, by a considerable margin." The marksmanship scores were indeed remarkable, but they told only part of the story. Sam's accuracy wasn't just the result of natural talent or extensive practice, it was the product of necessity. During his years on the Underground Railroad, a missed shot often meant the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. He had learned to make every bullet count, to shoot in darkness and fog, to hit moving targets while he himself was running. His rifle had become an extension of his will, as natural to him as the hammer he had once wielded in his forge. As if sensing their conversation, Sam looked up from helping the young soldier. His dark eyes met Shaw's for a brief moment, and the lieutenant colonel saw something that made his spine straighten. Intelligence, determination, and something else. Something that looked like barely contained power. In that brief exchange of glances, Shaw glimpsed the truth that Sam had kept hidden. This was not a man who had stumbled into war by accident or patriotic fervor. This was a warrior who had been fighting for freedom long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The quiet dignity that others mistook for weakness was actually the self-control of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and chose carefully when to reveal it. "Private Washington," Shaw called out. "A word, if you please." Sam approached with measured steps, his massive frame somehow managing to move with surprising grace. Each step was placed with deliberate precision, a habit learned from years of moving through hostile territory where a single misstep could alert pursuers or trigger a trap. His posture was erect but not rigid, alert but not tense. The bearing of a man who was always ready for action but never looking for trouble. "Yes, sir? I'm putting together a special reconnaissance unit for tomorrow's advance. I need men who can move unseen, gather intelligence, and, if necessary, eliminate threats quietly. Are you interested?" The other soldiers within earshot began to murmur among themselves. Tommy McKenna laughed outright, his voice carrying the cruel edge of someone who had never faced real danger. "Sir, with respect, how's he supposed to move unseen? He's like a walking mountain." The laughter that followed was nervous rather than genuinely amused. Some of the soldiers were beginning to sense that there was more to Sam than they had assumed, but their prejudices ran too deep to be easily overcome. They had built their sense of superiority on the assumption that they were inherently better soldiers than the black men who served alongside them. To admit that Sam might be exceptional would force them to question everything they believed about race and ability. Shaw's eyes never left Sam's face. In that moment, the young colonel was making a decision that would test not just Sam's abilities, but his own judgment as a leader. He had read the reports of Sam's previous missions, had noted the consistent success and the unusual details that suggested capabilities far beyond those of an ordinary soldier. Now he was betting the lives of his men on his assessment of this quiet giant. "Private Washington, what's your response?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the men who had spent months making him the target of their jokes. He saw the skepticism in their faces, the barely concealed hostility, the assumption that he would fail and prove their prejudices correct. But he also saw something else, a flicker of uncertainty in some eyes, a growing awareness that perhaps they had misjudged him. When he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Sir, I accept, but I have one request." "What's that, Private?" "When we encounter the enemy, let me go first." The laughter from the other soldiers died abruptly. There was something in Sam's tone, not bravado or anger, but the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of. It was the voice of someone who had faced death before and emerged victorious, who understood that leadership in combat was earned through action rather than words. Shaw studied Sam's face for another moment, seeing in those dark eyes the reflection of his own commitment to proving that courage and competence knew no color. Then he nodded. "Very well. We move out at dawn. Dismissed." As Sam walked back to his position, the whispers followed him. But for the first time since joining the regiment, some of those whispers carried a note of uncertainty rather than mockery. The more perceptive soldiers were beginning to realize that they might have been wrong about the quiet giant in their midst. That night, as the camp settled into the uneasy quiet that preceded battle, Sam sat alone, methodically checking his equipment. His rifle was clean and loaded, his bayonet sharp enough to shave with, and his pack contained items that would have surprised his fellow soldiers. Items that spoke of a man who had learned to survive in hostile territory long before he ever put on a Union uniform. Among these items was a small leather pouch containing herbs that could stop bleeding, a skill learned from a Cherokee medicine man who had helped him during a particularly dangerous mission. There was also a set of lockpicks, disguised as sewing implements, and a compass hidden in the handle of his knife. Most importantly, he carried letters, not from family, for he had none left alive, but from the families he had guided to freedom, letters that reminded him why he fought and what victory would mean for his people. In the distance, Confederate campfires flickered like fallen stars. Tomorrow, Sam knew, everything would change. The men who had spent months laughing at him would finally understand why his name had begun to circulate through Union camps from Virginia to Georgia, not as a joke, but as something approaching legend. As he settled down to rest, Sam's last thought before sleep was of the promise he had made to himself the day he enlisted, that he would prove his worth not with words, but with actions. Tomorrow, that promise would be tested in the crucible of battle. The mockery was about to end forever. Dawn broke over the Virginia countryside like a wound in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to prophesy the bloodshed to come. The morning air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass, mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder from distant skirmishes, while a low fog rolled off the Rappahannock River like the breath of sleeping giants. The 54th Massachusetts had been marching for 3 days through increasingly hostile territory, and now they found themselves positioned on a ridge overlooking the river, where Confederate forces had established what appeared to be an impregnable defensive position. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw stood with his field glasses, studying the enemy entrenchments through the morning haze. The Confederate position was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, artillery positioned on commanding heights, infantry trenches arranged in overlapping fields of fire, and natural obstacles that would channel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones. Beside him, Sergeant Williams pointed out key positions, while Sam Washington and 3 other volunteers prepared for their reconnaissance mission. "The Confederates have positioned themselves well," Shaw murmured, lowering his glasses. "Artillery on the high ground, infantry in trenches, and what appears to be cavalry reserves in the woods to the east. We need to know their exact numbers and find a weakness in their line." The other members of the reconnaissance team were carefully chosen veterans. Corporal Henderson, a career soldier with 8 years of experience, had volunteered despite his initial skepticism about Sam's abilities. Private Collins, barely 20 but already a veteran of 3 major battles, carried himself with the nervous energy of a man trying to prove his courage. Private Murphy, an Irish immigrant like McKenna but with a more open mind, had specifically requested to serve with Sam after witnessing his quiet competence during training exercises. Sam checked his equipment one final time, his movements deliberate and methodical. Unlike the standard-issue gear of his companions, his pack contained items that spoke of hard-earned experience: a coil of rope that had helped families cross treacherous rivers, a small mirror for signaling that had once saved his life when surrounded by Confederate patrols, dried meat that wouldn't spoil during extended missions, and a knife that had been honed to razor sharpness through years of use. Most importantly, he carried a detailed map of the area that he had memorized completely, a skill learned during his years guiding escaped slaves through unfamiliar territory, when a wrong turn could mean death for an entire family. The map in his mind was more than just topographical features. It included the locations of safe houses, the patterns of Confederate patrols, the seasonal changes in river levels, and the habits of local wildlife that could either betray or conceal a moving force. This knowledge had been accumulated through countless dangerous journeys, each one adding another layer to his understanding of how to move unseen through hostile territory. "Private Washington," Shaw approached him privately, his voice low enough that the other soldiers couldn't hear. "I want you to know that I'm sending you because I believe you're the best man for this job, not because of what others think of you." Sam nodded, his expression serious but untroubled. The young colonel's words carried weight, because they came from a man who had proven his commitment to equality through action rather than mere rhetoric. Shaw had fought alongside his black soldiers, had shared their dangers and their victories, and had earned their respect through competence and courage rather than demanding it through rank alone. "I understand, sir, but with respect, what others think stopped mattering to me a long time ago. What matters is bringing our boys home alive." The truth behind those words was darker than Shaw could imagine. Sam had learned to ignore mockery and prejudice during his childhood as a slave, when showing anger or hurt could result in a beating or worse. He had refined that skill during his years on the Underground Railroad, when maintaining emotional control could mean the difference between successful escape and catastrophic failure. The jokes and whispers of his fellow soldiers were nothing compared to the life-and-death situations he had navigated in the past. As the reconnaissance team prepared to depart, Tommy McKenna and Jake Morrison watched from their positions with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. The events of the previous evening had planted seeds of doubt about their assumptions, but prejudice dies hard, especially when it's been reinforced by years of social conditioning. $5 says the big man gets spotted before they're halfway down the ridge, McKenna whispered to Morrison, though his voice lacked the confident mockery of previous days. "You're on," Morrison replied, though he found himself hoping he would lose the bet. "Though I'll admit, there was something different about him last night. Did you see how he was preparing his gear, like he'd done this before?" The reconnaissance team moved out just as the sun cleared the horizon, its rays cutting through the morning fog in golden shafts that would provide both concealment and danger. Sam took point despite the protests of Corporal Henderson, who had assumed he would lead the mission based on his rank and experience. What happened next would be talked about in Union camps for years to come, a story that would grow with each telling but never exceed the remarkable reality. Moving down the ridge, Sam seemed to transform before his companions' eyes. The man they had known as clumsy and oversized became something else entirely, a ghost who could navigate terrain that should have been impossible for someone his size. He found paths through the underbrush that seemed to materialize from nowhere, avoided patches of ground that would have betrayed their presence with noise, and moved with a fluidity that defied his massive frame. His transformation was so complete that Henderson began to question his own perceptions. This was not the same man who had seemed awkward and out of place in the camp. This was someone who understood the landscape at an almost mystical level, who could read the wind and the shadows, who moved as if he had been born to this kind of warfare. "How is he doing that?" whispered Private Collins, a young soldier from Boston, who had volunteered for the mission to prove his courage to himself and his comrades. Collins had grown up in the city, where his knowledge of nature was limited to the small parks and gardens of his neighborhood. Watching Sam navigate the wilderness was like witnessing magic, the way he seemed to know instinctively which branches would support his weight, which paths would muffle his footsteps, which routes would keep them hidden from enemy observation posts. Henderson, watching Sam navigate a particularly treacherous section of rocky terrain without making a sound, began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I've been in this army for 8 years," he murmured back, his voice filled with growing respect, "and I've never seen anything like this." The corporal's admission carried special weight because of his experience. He had served with some of the Army's best scouts and reconnaissance specialists, had participated in missions behind enemy lines, and had developed what he thought was a good eye for natural talent. But Sam's abilities went beyond talent. They spoke of training and experience that no military academy could provide. As they approached the Confederate lines, Sam raised his hand, signaling for complete silence. Through a combination of hand signals and barely audible whispers, he communicated what he had observed. The enemy had more men than expected, but they had made a critical error in their positioning. There was a gap in their line where the terrain made them assume no attack could come from that direction. The gap was subtle, visible only to someone who understood both military tactics and the psychology of defensive positioning. The Confederate engineers had done excellent work overall, but they had made the classic mistake of assuming that difficult terrain was impassable terrain. Sam had learned during his Underground Railroad days that the most dangerous routes were often the safest, because pursuers would assume no one would be foolish enough to attempt them. But as they prepared to withdraw with their intelligence, disaster struck with the suddenness that characterized all combat. A Confederate patrol, moving through the woods on their routine morning sweep, stumbled upon their position. The lead Confederate soldier, a grizzled sergeant with tobacco-stained teeth and the weathered face of a career military man, raised his rifle just as he spotted Henderson crouched behind a fallen log. "Yankees!" the sergeant shouted, his voice carrying across the morning air like a death knell, shattering the peaceful silence and alerting every Confederate within a mile of their presence. In that instant, everything Sam had learned during his years on the Underground Railroad came flooding back with crystal clarity. The countless nights when discovery meant death not just for him, but for the families he was protecting. The moments when split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. The hard-earned knowledge that hesitation was often fatal, that survival required the ability to act without thought or doubt. Sam moved. What the Confederate patrol saw defied belief and challenged their understanding of human capability. The massive Union soldier seemed to flow like water, covering 20 feet of rough terrain in seconds that felt like hours. His movement was not the clumsy charge they expected from a man his size, but something far more dangerous, the controlled violence of a predator who had been hiding among prey. Before the Confederate sergeant could fully raise his rifle, Sam was upon him. The confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but in that brief time, the other members of the reconnaissance team witnessed something that would haunt their dreams and inspire their courage for the rest of their lives. Sam fought with a precision and lethality that spoke of training far beyond what any Union camp could provide. His movements were economical, deadly, and absolutely silent. He used his size not as a bludgeon but as a tool, leveraging his strength and reach with the skill of someone who had learned to fight for his life against multiple opponents. When it was over, 4 Confederate soldiers lay unconscious or dead, and the Union reconnaissance team was safe. But their position was compromised, and the sound of the sergeant's shout had carried far through the morning air. In the distance, they could hear shouts and the sound of men running through the woods, dogs barking, and the general alarm that meant the entire Confederate camp was being alerted to their presence. "We need to move now," Henderson whispered urgently, his respect for Sam now mixed with a healthy fear of what the big man was capable of when pushed to violence. Sam looked back toward the Confederate lines, then at his companions, and made a decision that would echo through military history. His face was calm, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had faced impossible odds before and found a way to survive. "You 3 head back to the regiment," he said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just proven his competence beyond any doubt. "Tell Colonel Shaw what we discovered about their positions. Tell him about the gap in their line." "What about you?" Collins asked, though he already suspected the answer and feared what it might mean. Sam checked his rifle and adjusted his pack, his movements deliberate and final. "I'm going to buy you time to get back safely, and I'm going to make sure the Confederates are too busy dealing with me to organize a proper pursuit." Henderson stared at him in disbelief, his military training warring with his growing understanding of what Sam was capable of. "Private, that's suicide. There are hundreds of them down there." Sam's smile was grim but confident, the expression of a man who had calculated the odds and found them acceptable. "Sergeant, with respect, you don't know what I'm capable of. None of you do, but you're about to find out." As his companions reluctantly began their withdrawal, Sam turned toward the Confederate camp. What he was about to do would transform him from the butt of jokes into a legend that would be whispered around campfires for generations. The hunt was about to begin, and Samuel Washington was no longer the prey. The Confederate camp erupted into chaos as Sam Washington descended upon them, like a force of nature unleashed from the depths of hell itself. What had begun as a routine morning in the enemy encampment became a nightmare that would be recounted in Southern military circles for decades to come, a story so incredible that many would dismiss it as wartime exaggeration until the evidence became too overwhelming to deny. Captain Jeremiah Blackwood, a veteran Confederate officer with a perfectly waxed mustache and the bearing of Virginia aristocracy, was reviewing morning reports in his tent when the first shots rang out. The sound was wrong, not the organized volley of an attacking force, but the sharp, precise cracks of a single rifle fired with deadly accuracy. Each shot was followed by a scream, a shout of alarm, or the ominous silence that meant another sentry had been eliminated. Blackwood had commanded men in battle for 3 years, had survived Shiloh and Chancellorsville, and had developed an instinct for the rhythm of combat. This was different. This was personal, targeted, and terrifyingly effective. The shots came from different directions, at irregular intervals, with a precision that spoke of exceptional marksmanship and tactical awareness. "What in the hell is happening out there?" Blackwood demanded, as his aide, Lieutenant Peters, burst into his tent, his face pale with confusion and fear. Peters was a young man from Charleston, the son of a plantation owner who had purchased his commission through family connections rather than military competence. He had never faced a situation like this, had never encountered an enemy who fought with such unconventional tactics. His hands shook as he tried to make sense of the reports flooding in from across the camp. "Sir, we're under attack, but it's just one man, sir, one Union soldier, but he's—" Peters struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a madman. "Sir, he's everywhere at once. Our sentries are dropping, our patrols are being eliminated, and no one can get a clear shot at him. Blackwood grabbed his pistol and stepped outside his tent, immediately ducking as a bullet whistled past his ear and struck the tent pole behind him with a sharp crack. The shot had come from an impossible angle, from a position that should have provided no cover for a marksman. In the distance, he could see muzzle flashes coming from what seemed like impossible positions, high in trees, behind rocks that should have provided no cover, from angles that defied military logic. "How many men are we facing?" Blackwood shouted over the growing din of confused orders and panicked soldiers. "That's just it." "Sir," Peters replied, his voice cracking with disbelief, "our scouts swear it's just one man, a giant of a man moving like a ghost." The description seemed impossible, but the evidence was mounting. Across the camp, Confederate soldiers were reporting encounters with a massive Union soldier, who appeared and disappeared like smoke, who struck with lethal precision and vanished before they could respond. Some claimed he could climb trees like a cat despite his size. Others swore he could move through underbrush without making a sound. All agreed that he was the most dangerous enemy they had ever faced. Meanwhile, Sam Washington was conducting a masterclass in guerrilla warfare that drew upon every skill he had learned during his years on the Underground Railroad. He moved through the Confederate camp like smoke, using the terrain, the confusion, and his intimate knowledge of human psychology to create the illusion of a much larger force. His strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Never stay in one position for more than 30 seconds, never take more than 2 shots from the same location, and always move in patterns that would make the enemy think they were facing multiple attackers. He used the Confederates' own assumptions against them. They expected a large, clumsy man to be easy to track and corner. Instead, they found themselves chasing shadows while their comrades fell around them. From his position behind a supply wagon, Sam took careful aim at a Confederate officer who was trying to organize a coherent response. The shot was perfect, not fatal, but incapacitating enough to remove another leader from the equation and add to the growing panic. As soldiers rushed toward his position, Sam was already gone, having slipped through a drainage ditch that carried him 50 yards away without being seen. The drainage ditch was part of the camp's engineering, designed to carry away rainwater during storms. Sam had identified it during his initial reconnaissance, recognizing it as a perfect route for unseen movement. His years of guiding escaped slaves had taught him to see terrain differently than soldiers did, not just as obstacles or cover, but as a network of hidden pathways that could be exploited by someone who understood their potential. The psychological effect was devastating. Confederate soldiers began firing at shadows, at each other, at anything that moved. The disciplined military unit that had awakened that morning was rapidly dissolving into a panicked mob. Officers shouted contradictory orders, soldiers abandoned their posts to hunt for an enemy they couldn't find, and the carefully planned defensive positions began to crumble as men left their assigned areas to join the chaotic pursuit. "There, in the trees," shouted a young Confederate private, pointing toward a copse of oak trees on the eastern edge of camp. A dozen soldiers opened fire on the trees, their bullets shredding leaves and bark in a display of firepower that would have been devastating if their target had actually been there. But Sam wasn't in the trees. He was behind them, having used the distraction to position himself for his next strike. As the soldiers reloaded, he emerged from concealment and eliminated 3 more sentries with shots so precise that the other Confederates didn't immediately realize what had happened. Each shot was calculated not just for lethality, but for maximum psychological impact. Sam targeted officers and non-commissioned officers first, removing the leadership that could organize an effective response. He aimed for sentries in positions where their bodies would be visible to other soldiers, creating a trail of evidence that would demoralize the enemy and make them question their own safety. Most importantly, he varied his tactics constantly, ensuring that the Confederates could never predict where he would strike next. Back on the ridge, the Union reconnaissance team had reached their own lines and was breathlessly reporting to Lieutenant Colonel Shaw. Henderson, still struggling to process what he had witnessed, tried to explain the impossible to an officer who had seen enough of war to know that impossible things happened with disturbing regularity. "Sir, Private Washington, he's not just fighting them. He's destroying them. I've never seen anything like it. It's like he knows exactly what they're going to do before they do it." Shaw listened to the distant sounds of battle, the chaotic, undisciplined firing that spoke of an enemy in complete disarray. Through his field glasses, he could see Confederate soldiers running in all directions, their formations completely broken, their defensive positions abandoned as men fled from an enemy they couldn't see or understand. "How long has he been at it?" Shaw asked, his voice tight with concern for his soldier and amazement at what was being accomplished. Collins checked his pocket watch, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline of their narrow escape. 47 minutes, sir, and the firing is getting more intense, not less. It's like he's getting stronger instead of weaker." Shaw made a decision that would change the course of the battle and demonstrate his growing understanding of Sam's capabilities. "Sergeant Williams, prepare the regiment for advance. If Private Washington has created this much chaos with one man, imagine what we can accomplish with a full assault while they're in disarray." "Sir," Williams said carefully, his respect for Sam now mixed with concern for his safety, "shouldn't we wait for Private Washington to withdraw?" Shaw's smile was grim but confident, reflecting his growing appreciation for the extraordinary soldier under his command. "Sergeant, I don't think Private Washington intends to withdraw. I think he intends to win this battle single-handedly." Down in the Confederate camp, Sam was indeed escalating his assault, moving from harassment to systematic destruction. Having eliminated most of the sentries and disrupted their communications, he began targeting their artillery positions. This required him to move deeper into enemy territory, but it also offered the opportunity to strike a blow that would cripple their defensive capabilities and potentially change the outcome of the entire engagement. The Confederate artillery battery was positioned on a small hill overlooking the river, protected by earthworks and manned by experienced gunners who had served together for 2 years. Under normal circumstances, it would have required a full company of infantry to assault such a position, supported by their own artillery and coordinated with other units. Sam Washington was about to prove that normal circumstances no longer applied when a single exceptional soldier was unleashed against an unprepared enemy. Using a combination of stealth and misdirection that drew upon every technique he had learned during his years on the Underground Railroad, he approached the artillery position from the one direction they would never expect, directly up the face of the hill they were positioned on. The climb was treacherous, requiring him to use his blacksmith's strength to pull himself up rocky outcroppings while carrying his full equipment load, moving with the silence of a cat despite his massive frame. The route he chose had been dismissed by the Confederate engineers as impassable, too steep and exposed for any attacking force to use. But Sam had learned long ago that the most dangerous paths were often the safest, because enemies would assume no one would be foolish enough to attempt them. His hands, scarred from years of working with hot metal, found purchase on rocks that would have defeated smaller men, while his experience moving through hostile territory taught him how to distribute his weight and minimize noise. When he reached the top, the Confederate gunners were so focused on the chaos in the camp below that they never saw him coming. They were veteran soldiers, men who had served their guns with distinction at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, but they had never faced an enemy like Sam Washington. In less than 5 minutes, Sam had disabled 3 cannons and eliminated their crews with an efficiency that would have impressed the most hardened military instructors. But his greatest challenge was yet to come. As he prepared to withdraw from the artillery position, he found himself face to face with Captain Blackwood and a dozen Confederate soldiers who had finally managed to track him down through a combination of luck and determination. "So," Blackwood said, his pistol trained on Sam's chest, his voice carrying the mixture of respect and hatred that characterized the Confederate officer class, "you're the ghost who's been terrorizing my men. I have to admit I'm impressed, but your luck has run out." Blackwood was a professional soldier, a man who had earned his rank through competence rather than connections. He recognized exceptional ability when he saw it, even in an enemy, even in a black man, whose very existence challenged everything he had been taught about racial hierarchy. But his respect was tempered by fury at the chaos Sam had created and the men he had killed. Sam looked at the Confederate soldiers surrounding him, noted their positions, their weapons, their state of mind. In that moment, he made a calculation that would determine not just his own fate but the outcome of the entire battle. These men were tired, demoralized, and frightened. They had been chasing shadows for over an hour, had seen their comrades fall to an enemy they couldn't understand, and were operating on adrenaline and desperation rather than tactical thinking. "Captain," Sam said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "you're right about one thing. Someone's luck has definitely run out." What happened next would be talked about in military academies for generations to come, analyzed by tacticians and historians who would struggle to understand how one man could accomplish what Sam Washington achieved in the next 30 seconds. In that brief span of time, Samuel Washington transformed from surrounded prey into an unstoppable force of nature, proving once and for all why his name had begun to circulate through Union camps as something approaching legend. The final act of his one-man war was about to begin, and it would redefine what was possible on a battlefield. The confrontation atop the artillery hill lasted exactly 28 seconds. When it was over, Captain Blackwood lay unconscious with a concussion that would plague him for months. His remaining soldiers were either dead or fleeing in terror, and Samuel Washington stood alone among the disabled cannons, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sky like a monument to impossible courage. Blood dripped from a cut on his forehead, his uniform was torn in 3 places, and his hands were scraped raw from the brutal hand-to-hand combat, but he remained standing, undefeated, and more dangerous than ever. The speed and ferocity of Sam's assault had been beyond anything the Confederate soldiers had imagined possible. He had moved like lightning given human form, using his size and strength not as crude weapons, but as precisely calibrated tools of destruction. His blacksmith's hands, trained to shape iron and steel, had proven equally adept at breaking bones and crushing windpipes. His knowledge of human anatomy, learned through years of treating injuries on the Underground Railroad, had allowed him to incapacitate enemies with surgical precision. But Sam's war was far from over. In the distance, he could see Confederate reinforcements rushing up the hill, at least 30 men, led by a colonel who had finally grasped the magnitude of the threat they were facing. At the same time, he spotted Union forces beginning their advance across the river, led by Lieutenant Colonel Shaw himself, their blue uniforms bright against the morning landscape as they moved with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers. The Confederate reinforcements were a mixed unit, infantry, cavalry, and artillery personnel who had abandoned their posts to deal with the crisis Sam had created. They moved with the desperate energy of men who knew their entire defensive position was collapsing around them. Their colonel, a veteran of the Mexican War with gray hair and steel blue eyes, had realized that this was no ordinary Union raid, but something far more dangerous. A single soldier who was systematically destroying their ability to fight. Sam made a decision that would cement his place in military history. Instead of attempting to escape or hold his position defensively, he did something that defied every principle of military tactics. He charged. Down the hill he came, his war cry echoing across the battlefield like thunder, a sound that seemed to emerge from the very earth itself and carry with it the fury of every injustice he had ever witnessed. The sight was beyond anything the Confederate reinforcements had prepared for. They had expected to corner a trapped enemy, to overwhelm him with superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they found themselves facing a sight that seemed to emerge from their worst nightmares, a giant Union soldier, moving with impossible speed and precision, bearing down on them with the fury of righteous vengeance and the skill of a master warrior. His charge was not the wild rush of a desperate man, but the calculated assault of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Sam had studied the terrain during his approach, had noted the positions where the enemy would be forced to bunch together, had identified the psychological pressure points that would break their formation. As he descended the hill, he moved like an avalanche, unstoppable, devastating, and absolutely terrifying. The psychological impact was devastating. These were veteran soldiers, men who had fought at Bull Run and Antietam, who had faced Union charges and artillery barrages without flinching. They had seen cavalry charges and bayonet assaults, had witnessed the carnage of Gettysburg and the horror of Fredericksburg. But the sight of Sam Washington in full assault broke something fundamental in their understanding of warfare. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Confederate Private Billy Hawkins, a farm boy from Alabama who had never seen anything that terrified him more than this single Union soldier. He ain't human. He can't be human. Hawkins had grown up hunting in the Alabama wilderness, had faced down bears and wildcats without flinching, had thought himself prepared for anything war could throw at him. But watching Sam charge down that hill, he felt a primal terror that reached back to humanity's earliest fears, the fear of being hunted by something stronger, faster, and more intelligent than oneself. The Confederate line wavered, then broke completely. Soldiers who had stood firm against overwhelming odds found themselves running from one man whose presence seemed to fill the entire battlefield. Sam pursued them not with cruelty, but with the relentless efficiency of a force of nature, eliminating resistance and driving the enemy before him like leaves before a hurricane. His pursuit was methodical and terrifying. He moved through the broken Confederate formation like a scythe through wheat, his rifle and bayonet working with deadly precision. But it was not mindless slaughter. Every action was calculated to maximize the psychological impact, to break the enemy's will to fight rather than simply kill as many as possible. He understood that a demoralized enemy was more valuable than a dead one, that soldiers who fled in terror would spread panic faster than any bullet. From across the river, the Union soldiers watched in stunned amazement as their advance became unnecessary. The Confederate position, which should have required hours of bloody fighting to overcome, was collapsing before their eyes like a house of cards in a hurricane. Tommy McKenna, who had bet against Sam just hours earlier, found himself speechless as he watched the man he had mocked single-handedly routing an entire Confederate regiment. "Mother of God," he whispered to Jake Morrison, his Irish accent thick with awe and shame. "We've been sharing a camp with a legend and didn't even know it." McKenna's worldview was crumbling as he watched Sam's impossible assault. Everything he had believed about racial hierarchy, about the supposed superiority of white soldiers, about the nature of courage and competence, was being shattered by the actions of one extraordinary black man. The prejudices that had seemed so natural and obvious just hours before now appeared as the ignorant assumptions they had always been. Morrison nodded, his face pale with awe and shame. "All those jokes we made, all those times we called him clumsy, slow, weak. Jesus, Tommy, what kind of men are we?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond military matters. They were being forced to confront not just their misjudgment of Sam, but their entire system of beliefs about race and ability. The comfortable assumptions that had allowed them to feel superior were being destroyed by the undeniable evidence of Sam's extraordinary capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Shaw, leading the Union advance, found himself in the surreal position of conducting a pursuit rather than an assault. The Confederate forces were in full retreat, their defensive positions abandoned, their artillery disabled, their morale completely shattered. What should have been a costly frontal assault had become a rout thanks to the actions of one exceptional soldier. "Sergeant Williams," Shaw called as they crossed the river, his voice filled with amazement and professional admiration. "Have you ever seen anything like this in your military career?" Williams, a man who had witnessed some of the war's bloodiest battles and most heroic actions, shook his head in amazement. "Sir, in 20 years of soldiering, I've never seen one man accomplish what Private